Welcome students to the lecture on topic Marxian concept of class. In this lecture, we will discuss the Marxian concept of class and class conflict, various types of classes that have emerged at different stages of the social development of human society, the link between economic mode of production and the nature of the class structure. And finally, we will discuss the class basis of the state formation and the political power. Dear students, the concept of class and class conflict is fundamental to Marxian social theory. Marx recognizes only economic basis of the social division and conflict. It is the economic mode of production that shapes up the class structure within a society. It is rooted in his theory of historical materialism. Marx develops materialistic interpretation of history by applying dialectics for explaining social progress in terms of material changes. He argued that man is constituted by his desires, his economic needs, work, and the economic system of which he is a part. For him, economic activity determines the basis of all other activities of man. The political structure, legal framework, and moral concepts are all derived from the way in which economic activity is structured. History, according to Marx, is a record of the self-development of productive forces. Each stage is characterized by social formation which has its own distinct mode of production. Thus, the society has evolved through various stages, that is, the primitive communism, the slave society, the feudalism, the capitalism, and finally the classless society of the future. This will be the culmination of human progress and will lead to man's complete emancipation. Each of these stages is determined through a corresponding mode of production. Thus, with change in mode of production, society itself changes and a new social formation comes into existence. Each of these stages is objectively superior to the earlier social formation because it brings relation of production in line with change in the forces of production. Each of these evolving stages is better than the previous one, because it relatively emancipates the economically disadvantaged class. For example, the condition of the serf in feudal system is better than that of slave. Marx believed that the most fundamental element in society was the technological and economic, on which was built the social, political, and cultural superstructure. Marx's argument was that the nature of economic relations of a given society is dependent upon the mode of production of that society. Marx argued that every mode of production has certain distinct relations of production. There is, in other words, a certain linkage between the mode of production and the relations of production. What Marx means by the relations of production is the sort of relations in which men enter for purposes of production. For instance, around land there used to be landlord-tenant relations. With the development of industry and factory system, we have now the relations between the factory owners or entrepreneurs and the workers. Marx asserted that the overall social relations of a community are primarily dependent upon the mode of production and the resultant relations of production. This is the controlling element around which all other factors revolve. Thus, according to Marx, nature of the mode of production determines the class structure within a society. For Marx, class is an economic category. With the inception of the institution of private property, society has got divided into two mutually contending classes. Thus, according to Karl Marx, in all stratified societies, there are two major social groups, a ruling class and a subject class. The ruling class derives its powers from its ownership and control of the forces of production. The ruling class exploits and oppresses the subject class as a result, there is a basic conflict of interest between the two classes. He says that primitive communism is represented by the societies of prehistory and provides the only example of the classless society so far. Beyond that, all societies are divided into two major classes: masters and slaves in slave society, lords and serfs in feudal society, and capitalist or bourgeoisie and wage laborers or proletariat in capitalist society. Marx and Engels stated in the Communist Manifesto that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes: freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another. Here, Marxian theory of class conflict is fundamentally and completely different from the usual theory of conflict. For him, other conflicts in society are of secondary character and reconcilable, or else these are at some level to be located in economic causes. For Marx, conflict is fundamentally a class conflict. Class to him is an economic category rooted in the emergence of private property that divides society between economically dominant and economically deprived, that is, haves and have-nots. A class is defined by the ownership of property, that is, those who own property make one class and those who do not own property make another class. Such ownership vests a person with the power to exclude others from the property and to use it for the personal purposes. His understanding of property is broader. For him, division on the basis of property is between those who own the means of production such as machinery and factory buildings, whose source of income is profit, and those who are excluded from this and are constrained to work for the privileged to earn their living. Classes are thus formed on the basis of common interest. For Marx, individuals form classes to the extent that their interest is engaged them in a struggle with the opposite class. Coming back to the social conflict theory of Marx, as said earlier, is rooted in the division of human society on economic terms between haves and have-nots. This conflict between economically dominant and economically deprived classes is fundamental to his general social theory. The nature of the composition of these classes is different at different levels of societal development of human society. The variation in the structure of economy determines the distinctness of classes at different stages. One thing common is class antagonism and conflict, which is fundamentally economic in origin and character, but does not remain restricted to economy only. It gets manifestation in overall domination and hegemony of economically superior class. The economic hegemony of the dominant class gets reinforced by politics and culture, that is, state and legitimacy mechanisms referred to as ideology. In other words, economic classes are not only economic classes, they also become political classes or ruling and ruled classes in political sense as well. Hegemony thus is reinforced at several levels. It is rooted in economy but reinforced through political, cultural and ideological apparatuses. Thus, for Karl Marx, state emerged and exists as a class institution. It is a product of class division of society into haves and have-nots. It is an instrument of coercion and is controlled by the economically dominant class to safeguard its economic interest and privilege. For Marx, political power stems from the economic power. In history, at different stages of social development, state has remained under the control of the dominant class of the time. For example, as economic power shifted from feudal class to the bourgeoisie, the system of kingship gave way to the representative democracy, which is controlled by entrepreneurs. The ideology of divine right of kings gives place to modern liberalism. The ideology is used to consolidate the domination of the dominant class on the structure of power, especially law, police, and judicial apparatus. The state becomes an instrument in the hands of the dominant class to exploit weaker classes in society. Thus, according to Karl Marx, in all stratified class-divided societies, there are two major social groups, a ruling class and a subject class. The ruling class derives its power from its ownership and control of the forces of production. The ruling class exploits and oppresses the subject class. As a result, there is a basic conflict of interest between the two classes. Karl Marx believed that Western society has developed through four main epochs: primitive communism, slave society, feudal society, and capitalist society. Primitive communism in the earliest times was represented by the small societies of simple needs drawing commonly from nature. There was no concept of private ownership and provided the only example of the classless society. This stage ends with the development of private property, especially with the development of large-scale agriculture. With the emergence of private property, the society got divided into two major classes of haves and have-nots. Since then, all societies have been divided into two major classes: masters and slaves in ancient society, lords and serfs in medieval feudal society, and capitalist and wage laborers in modern capitalist society. The second stage in social development of man in history, referred to as slave society, is considered to be the beginning of class society. Here, with the emergence of private property, the idea of class appears. On the one side, there is a slave-owning ruling class referred to as masters, and on the other, there are slaves. The state develops during this stage as a tool for the slave owners used to control the slaves. The slave-owning class own the land and slaves, which are the main means of producing wealth, while as the vast majority have very little or nothing. The property-less, mainly the slaves, work for no money. Of all classes so far, the position of slaves as a class was worst. They were reduced to the level of animal property, like that of cattle, that could be even bought and sold by the masters. The need to keep conquering more slaves created huge problems. It is ultimately the aristocracy born in this epoch that demolishes it and forces society to step into the next stage. The third stage is called feudalism. It appears after slave society collapses. This was the most dominant mode of production during the Middle Ages in Europe. Under this system, the state is ruled by monarchs who inherit their positions and was linked to feudal nobility with whom the prestige and power was shared. During feudalism, there were mainly two major classes such as feudal nobility and serfs. Serfs were tied to land and cultivated it for the nobility in return for a certain share of the produce. Capitalism is considered as the fourth stage in the sequence of the stages in human history. Marx paid special attention to this stage in the historical development. It appears as a result of material transformation that gradually undermined feudalism and facilitated the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. Towards the later part of the medieval age, development of technology facilitated the trade and resulted in the emergence of new merchant class. Out of the merchant riches, a capitalist class emerged that gradually reduced the economic importance of the feudal nobility. Thus, this pushed this new class into conflicts with the feudal aristocracy. The old feudal kings and lords found it difficult to accept the new social changes that the capitalist class wanted for fear of losing their power base. The capitalists pushed for greater transformation, both in economy and politics. This, as per Marx, begins an epoch of social revolutions. The series of these revolutions demolished the economic and political structures in these countries, whereby political power is transferred from feudal nobility to this new economic class that was named as bourgeoisie or as capitalist class. The prominent such changes in Europe were marked by the Glorious Revolution of England in 1688 and the French Revolution in 1789 that became precursor to various such changes all over the Europe and subsequently in the rest of the world. Through these revolutions, political power was effectively transferred from monarchy and feudal nobility to the bourgeoisie through a facade of representative institutions. In capitalism, workers are rewarded according to their contract with their employer. In the capitalist-controlled parliament, laws are made to protect wealth. But according to Marx, capitalism, like slave society and feudalism, also has some inner contradictions which will lead to its downfall. The working class, to which the capitalist class gave birth in order to produce commodities and profits, is the grave digger of capitalism. The worker is not paid the full value of what he or she produces. The rest is surplus, the capitalist's profit, which Marx calls the unpaid labor of the working class. The capitalists are forced by competition to attempt to drive down the wages of the working class to increase their profits, and this creates conflict between the classes and gives rise to the development of class consciousness in the working class. In view of the classical Marxism, the struggles of the working class against the attacks of the capitalist class will lead the working class to establish its own collective control over production, which is the basis of socialist society. Marx believed that capitalism will always lead to monopolies and pushes the people to poverty. Yet there are fewer restrictions on the free market. The increasing exploitation of the working class leads to economic crisis. One feature of capitalism is that it brings workers together and creates a sense of community consciousness in them. Growing class consciousness in them is finally paving way for the organized class action. This will precipitate crises that will result in the collapse of capitalism and transition to a socialist ordering of society through a workers' or proletarian revolution. Initially, Marx thought that the revolution would be violent, but later he modified his views to incorporate the possibility of other peaceful gradual electoral processes to revolution. Under capitalism, the progressive class is the proletariat, which is destined to overthrow capitalism and establish socialism, which will eventually evolve into communism. In the first stages of socialism, the state is a dictatorship of the proletariat. That is, the proletariat rules the other classes by force. Here the socialist slogan is "from each according to his ability to each according to his work." During the course of socialism, proletarian class will destroy all signs of class society that will evolve to the establishment of communism, the final stage of social development. It will operate on the principle that from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. With the abolition of private ownership of property and class, a classless, cooperative and a human society will be born. With these words, dear students, I conclude this lecture. Hope you find the lecture useful and informative. Goodbye and God bless you.